They say silence has a language all its own, one that speaks louder than words when the heart is willing to listen. In this story, you'll witness a bond formed not by voice, but by presence, not by command, but by trust. It's a story of healing, loyalty, and the kind of love that changes everything. Welcome to Veil Marks, where every tale is a mark left on the soul. This isn't just a story. It's a lesson wrapped in fur, tears, and courage. Stay with us until the very end, because what you're about to see might just stay with you forever. The wind swept through the barren fields of rural Texas, carrying the chill of a winter afternoon that seemed to settle into every crack and crevice of the old county animal shelter. The building sat at the edge of town, faded and forgotten like so many of the lives it housed. Its roof creaked with age, and the cold seeped through the walls like a slow-moving ghost. Inside, behind rows of metal bars and cement floors, the air was thick with the scent of disinfectant, old straw, and something sadder, resignation. At the very end of the longest hallway, far from the main entrance and the cheerful barking of younger dogs, lay a single kennel bathed in shadows. And in that kennel, barely moving, was Max. He was a large Pitbull, his once sleek gray coat now dulled with time and grime. A deep scar carved across his back leg, an old wound barely healed. His eyes, once sharp and alert, were now distant, fixed on nothing in particular. He didn't move. He didn't bark. He simply existed. But Max had not always been like this. Years ago, Max had worn a vest, dark navy blue, stitched with the letters K9 Rescue Unit. He had been a search and rescue dog, trained to detect human scent through rubble, smoke, and chaos. In one of his final missions, after a building collapsed during a freak storm, Max had clawed through twisted metal and broken concrete for hours. He had found a teenage girl trapped beneath a fallen beam. Her fingers were bloodied, her breath shallow, but Max had barked until help arrived. She survived. Max had saved her, but no medals came. No parades. During that mission, a steel rod had crushed part of his hind leg. Despite surgeries, Max never walked the same again. The department deemed him unfit for service. A hero turned liability. His handler, also injured, moved out of state for treatment and couldn't take him. Promises were made to find him a good home. Those promises were never kept. Instead, Max was transferred from shelter to shelter, slowly fading from the memory of those who once praised him. In this last stop, a shelter with too many dogs and not enough space, Max became just another nameless case. Worse, his breed worked against him. Pitbulls, people whispered, were dangerous, aggressive, unpredictable. No one mentioned the quiet loyalty in his eyes or the bravery stitched into his bones. The staff called him the Silent One. He didn't cry like the others. He didn't pace or whimper. He lay still day after day facing the back wall. His food bowls often stayed untouched. Sometimes the staff found small puddles from the cold water freezing overnight. No complaints came from Max, only silence. Few visitors ever made it to his end of the hallway. Most were drawn to the bouncing tails, the excited barks, the warm eyes pressing against cages further up. Max had stopped expecting. He no longer stood when footsteps echoed, no longer wagged his tail when voices neared. The flicker of hope that once lit his chest had gone out, replaced by a heavy, wordless acceptance. But he listened. Max always listened. One afternoon, as sleet tapped against the thin windows and the sky outside turned the color of ash, two shelter employees stood just a few feet from his kennel, speaking in hushed tones. "He hasn't eaten in 3 days," the first one murmured, arms crossed tightly to her chest. "It's been 6 months," the other replied, rubbing his neck. "No calls, no interest, no signs of recovery." The woman's voice lowered. "You know the board's policy. We're out of space." The man didn't respond right away. Then he sighed. "1 more week. That's all I can buy him." Max didn't lift his head, but his ears twitched. He had learned to read voices long ago, not their words, but the rhythm beneath them. He heard the finality in their tone, the weariness, the decision already made. Inside his chest, something shifted. Not pain exactly, but the ghost of something once known. Longing, perhaps, or memory. He remembered the day he first wore the rescue vest, the way his handler had knelt beside him, hands firm on his shoulders, and said, "You're going to save lives, Max. I trust you." He remembered the scent of smoke and concrete, the girl's heartbeat beneath the rubble, the way her hand had rested on his snout when they pulled her out. And now, no one remembered. No one cared. The world had moved on without him. A draft passed through the hallway, rattling the thin metal doors. Somewhere down the corridor, a puppy yipped with excitement. Another barked in protest. Max did neither. But in that quiet moment, as the footsteps of the two workers faded and the building fell back into silence, a single tear slipped from the corner of his eye. It tracked through the dust on his muzzle and dropped soundlessly onto the concrete. He didn't cry from pain. He cried because even the bravest hearts can break in silence. And in that silence he waited. Not for rescue, not anymore, but for something smaller, almost invisible. A reason, just one. One reason to keep listening. One reason to keep breathing. One reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been completely forgotten. Not yet. Not entirely. Not if someone could still see him. Even if just once. Even if only for a moment. And somewhere beyond the snow and concrete walls, that moment was already on its way, wrapped in the quiet footsteps of a child who hadn't spoken in months. But Max didn't know that yet. All he knew was the cold, the scar that ached with every movement, and the silence he had become a part of, but not forever. The next morning arrived gray and quiet. The sky hung low with clouds that seemed to press down on the small Texas town like a heavy breath. James sat behind the wheel of his dusty blue pickup truck, glancing now and then at the boy beside him. Lucas, his 9-year-old son, stared silently out the window, his face pale, unreadable, distant. His small hands were tucked inside the sleeves of his coat, and his shoulders curved inward, as if the cold lived inside him and not just in the air. It had been 10 months since the accident. 10 months since the rain-slick highway. 10 months since the twisted wreckage. 10 months since the scream James would never forget, and the silence that followed, the one that never left. Lucas hadn't spoken a word since that night. He hadn't cried either. Not when they lowered her into the ground. Not when he moved into his new room. Not when James, once a man of stoic calm, broke down in the hallway with his head in his hands. There was only silence now. James had tried everything. Therapy, special schools, art classes, but nothing reached his son. Lucas lived in a world behind glass, and James couldn't find the door to get in. A child psychologist had made a quiet suggestion during their last visit. A companion animal. Not just a dog, she'd said. A connection. Someone who doesn't demand words to understand him. So here they were, turning into the gravel lot of the county animal shelter. The tires crunched on frost-dusted stone as James parked beside the cracked sign that read, "Home for Tails, County Rescue." The building looked tired, like it had seen too much and slept too little. "Ready?" James asked gently. Lucas gave a small nod, not looking at him. Inside, warmth replaced the cold, but it was the kind of warmth that came from recycled air and old space heaters. The moment they stepped into the hallway, a wave of barking surged toward them. Dozens of dogs behind metal gates, leaping, pawing, barking for attention. Lucas didn't flinch. He just stood still, hands still tucked in his sleeves, eyes scanning the rows. A shelter volunteer with a kind smile and a clipboard approached. "Hi there. You looking for someone special today?" James hesitated. "We're hoping maybe we can find a friend for my son." The woman smiled gently and began leading them down the hallway. She gestured toward a few dogs along the way. "This one's great with kids, very playful, and this one's a cuddler, loves belly rubs." But Lucas didn't slow down. He walked past wagging tails and eager eyes like he wasn't even there for them. His steps were soft, his gaze distant. And then he stopped. At the very end of the hall, in front of the last kennel. The dog inside didn't bark, didn't pace. He simply lay curled in the corner, facing the wall. A gray Pitbull, large and scarred, with a faint tremble in his back leg and a deep stillness that felt like grief in physical form. Maximum. Lucas knelt slowly. He didn't speak. He didn't reach through the bars. He just sat, quietly, still. And inside the kennel, Max's ear twitched. Then his head turned. It was a movement so small, so slow, it was almost imperceptible. But Max was looking at him now, his cloudy eyes focusing in a way they hadn't for months. He raised his head slightly and sniffed the air. Lucas raised one hand, palm facing forward, and gently placed it against the cold metal bars. Max inched forward, slowly, cautiously. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Then, without warning or hesitation, Max pressed his forehead gently against the bars, touching the small hand that waited there. No barking, no licking, just contact, connection. The volunteer had stopped walking and now stood a few feet away, watching in disbelief. "That's Max," she said softly. He's he hasn't reacted like this with anyone." James stepped closer, unsure of what he was witnessing. Lucas's shoulders were no longer drawn tight. His posture softened, his lips curved upward, not wide, but enough to change the shape of his face. The first smile James had seen in almost a year. James felt his own chest tighten. "Lucas," he said quietly, kneeling beside his son. "He's older, and he's a pit bull. He has a limp. Are you sure?" Lucas didn't speak, but he looked up at his father, eyes wide and filled with something James hadn't seen in so long he'd almost forgotten what it looked like. Hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. Lucas turned back to Max and pressed his hand once more to the bars. Max leaned in again, eyes half closed, as if savoring the warmth of something that didn't hurt. A long silence passed between them. Then James stood and faced the volunteer. "What do we need to do?" She blinked. You want Max?" James nodded. "He's the one." Later that afternoon, the paperwork was signed. A worn blanket was gently draped over Max as James carried him to the truck. Lucas sat in the back seat, waiting. Max was lowered beside him, and Lucas, without hesitation, rested his hand on the dog's massive paw. James started the engine. In the rearview mirror, he watched his son lean in and place his head gently against Max's shoulder. No words were spoken. But for the first time in a long time, James didn't feel the silence was empty. For the first time in forever, it was full of something else. Understanding. Trust. The beginning of something neither of them could name, but both already knew. They had found each other. A boy who didn't speak. A dog who didn't bark. But somehow, in the space between them, everything that needed to be said was heard. The first night home was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that made a house peaceful, but the kind that lingered in corners, clung to the walls, and filled the spaces between footsteps with something heavy. James unlocked the door and stepped aside as Lucas led Max in gently. The pit bull's paws clicked against the hardwood floor with hesitant rhythm, his body low to the ground, his tail unmoving. The house smelled unfamiliar to him. Wood polish, old fabric, a faint trace of citrus cleaner. But more than that, it felt still. Too still. Lucas walked ahead, his small backpack bouncing softly against his back. On one of the zippers, a tiny silver bell chimed faintly with each step. A last-minute idea James had thought might help Max track the boy more easily. Max's ears twitched at the sound. He followed, slowly, cautiously, the tremor in his hind leg more noticeable after the long ride. James watched from the doorway, unsure whether he felt nervous, hopeful, or just tired. Lucas led Max to the den, a warm room with a low couch, a faded rug, and a pile of old blankets. The boy didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He knelt, patted the rug once, then sat cross-legged beside it. Max looked at him, unmoving for a beat, then stepped forward and carefully lowered himself onto the blanket, curling into a slow, weary coil. Lucas reached into his backpack and pulled out a small notepad and pen. He scribbled something, tore off the page, and handed it to his father. "He can sleep here tonight," the note said. James read it, nodded, and knelt beside them both. "We'll keep it warm for him, buddy," he whispered. Lucas offered a small smile, brief but real, and then slid his hand across Max's back. Not a rough pet, not a scratch behind the ears, just a gentle, slow touch, like he was trying to memorize the shape of him. That night, James lay awake in his room, listening. He heard the wind outside, the quiet creak of the floorboards, and then nothing else. No barking, no crying, only the sound of the bell, faint and rhythmic as Max repositioned beside his son. Lucas didn't speak. Max didn't bark. But the silence between them had begun to shift. It wasn't the empty silence of grief anymore. It was something else, something patient, something alive. In the mornings, Lucas would wake before the sun and tiptoe into the kitchen. He wrote Max's name on a bowl and filled it with kibble, crouching beside him while the dog slowly ate, still cautious, still recovering from a long stretch of hunger and heartbreak. Lucas never rushed him. Sometimes he whispered. Not words exactly, but little sounds, soft hums, the rhythm of a child learning to trust the air around him again. Max, in turn, began eating more with each passing day, not frantically, not desperately. Just enough to say, "I belong here. I'm trying." Every afternoon after school, Lucas would walk around the backyard, the silver bell on his bag gently chiming with every step. Max followed, a few paces behind, drawn to the sound like a compass to north. Lucas took slow laps around the yard, pausing now and then to kneel and scratch Max behind the ears or press a hand against his chest. Sometimes James watched from the kitchen window, arms folded, coffee cooling in his hand. He still wasn't sure how all of this was happening. He had adopted Max for Lucas, to help the boy heal, but somehow it felt like Max was healing them both. James hadn't realized just how quiet the house had been until this other kind of quiet replaced it. Not silence, but calm, presence, togetherness. There were setbacks. Of course there were. Max flinched at loud noises. He avoided the sound of the vacuum. He barked once, hoarse and panicked, when a neighbor's motorcycle roared too close to the yard. Lucas froze when it happened, unsure what to do, but then gently reached for the bell and gave it a soft jingle. Max turned his head. Lucas crouched down and patted the ground beside him. Max came, slowly, until his body was beside the boy's again. No one said a word. But Max lay down, exhaled, and closed his eyes. One night, as cold rain tapped against the windows, James walked past Lucas's room and noticed the light still on. The door was slightly ajar. He peeked in and froze. Lucas was curled up in bed, the blankets pulled up to his chest. Max lay beside him, pressed close, his chin resting gently on the boy's chest. Lucas's hand rested on Max's head. But what stopped James cold was the boy's breathing, shallow, rapid, and uneven. A nightmare. James started forward but stopped as Max stirred. The Pitbull lifted his head just slightly and nudged Lucas's chin. Then, very gently, he laid his head back on the boy's chest, this time directly over his heart. Lucas's breathing slowed, his body relaxed, and James, still standing in the hallway, felt a tightness in his throat that hadn't been there in years. That moment changed something. From that night on, Max was no longer just a rescue. He became a fixture in Lucas's life, a partner, a shadow, a guardian. Lucas began to draw again. He drew Max lying in the sun, Max chasing butterflies, Max sleeping with his snout pressed into Lucas's pillow. On one page, he drew their silhouettes side by side under a tree, with the words written carefully at the bottom. "You found me. I'll never lose you." Max didn't need commands. He didn't need praise. He needed one thing only: proximity. To be near the boy who had seen him when no one else had. And for Lucas, the boy who had fallen into silence, Max gave him something beyond speech. A sense of safety, a rhythm, a reason to open his heart again. In that small house on a quiet street in Texas, a boy who didn't talk and a dog who didn't bark built something stronger than sound. They built trust. One quiet day at a time. Over the following weeks, something extraordinary began to unfold in the quiet corners of the house. A friendship that didn't need words to be real. Lucas, who still hadn't spoken out loud, began creating his own form of communication with Max. He started with simple gestures, pointing to objects, tapping on the floor, raising a single finger to mean wait. Max, as if understanding that language wasn't something this boy could offer, leaned into every movement with unusual attentiveness. It was as though he'd been waiting his whole life for someone who spoke like this, through stillness, through presence, through the spaces between sound. Lucas soon added a new touch, a soft bell, strung on a leather loop tied around his wrist. With every step he took, the bell rang, a delicate silver sound that danced lightly through the halls. Max followed it like a tether, like a beacon in the dark. When Lucas went to the kitchen, Max padded behind him. When Lucas sat in the backyard with his knees drawn to his chest, Max lay beside him, ears trained on that tiny sound, nose close to the boy's hand. James watched it all unfold with a quiet awe. He had been afraid that Max's silence would mirror Lucas's too much, that two broken things couldn't fix each other. But he'd been wrong. There was something sacred in their silence, something powerful. They didn't need to be whole in the way the world expected them to be. They only needed each other. Lucas began sketching in his notebook more often. He drew Max with simple pencil strokes, always capturing his gentle eyes, his strong shoulders, the way he walked with one paw slightly raised as if testing the world before him. And then, one rainy afternoon while cleaning out a storage box in the hallway closet, Lucas stumbled upon something unexpected. A small canvas bag, marked with faded letters. Max, K9 Unit. Inside were old items from Max's past, a worn harness, an ID tag, and a folded photograph. Lucas sat cross-legged on the floor and opened the photo with careful fingers. It showed Max, years younger, his fur darker and his body leaner, sitting beside a girl in a rescue uniform. The girl looked about 16, her arm slung proudly around Max's neck. Both of them were covered in dust and dirt, but they were smiling. Him with his eyes, her with her whole face. Lucas stared at the picture for a long time. He didn't know who the girl was, but he felt something stir in his chest. Max had been someone's partner once. He had already saved a life. He had already been loved. The weight of that hit Lucas in a quiet way, gentle but lasting. It didn't make him feel less important to Max. It made him feel honored to be chosen next. He taped the photo above his desk, beside his sketches. Each morning after that, he would glance at it before heading off to school. And Max, somehow, would always be waiting by the door, tail wagging faintly, as if sensing Lucas's thoughts before he even moved. One evening, As twilight melted across the sky, James sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. He watched as Lucas curled up on the living room rug with Max, the boy's hand gently resting on the dog's side, the bell on his wrist still ringing faintly with each movement. James blinked hard. For a moment, it was like watching the past and the future exist at once. He remembered his wife in those quiet moments, how she used to sit with Lucas in the same spot, reading books aloud, even when Lucas had fallen asleep. How she used to hum softly while folding laundry, a sound so ordinary yet so deeply missed. There was a kind of music in those silences, and now somehow it had returned. Not the same song, but a new one, played in bells and gestures, shared between a boy and his dog. It was in that moment James realized Max hadn't just helped Lucas heal. He had helped James, too. The house no longer felt frozen in grief. The air had shifted. The silence, once unbearable, was now meaningful. It wasn't empty anymore. It held something, the echo of love still alive, the rhythm of trust being rebuilt, the quiet whisper of healing taking root. And in the center of it all, between the boy who still hadn't spoken and the dog who rarely made a sound, was a bond unshakable, unexplainable, and absolutely unforgettable. The air that afternoon was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. Rain had fallen earlier that morning, leaving the woods behind Lucas's house damp and fragrant, the ground soft beneath every step. It was the kind of day that invited curiosity, the sky a muted blue, the trees swaying gently, and small rays of sunlight piercing through the canopy like spotlights on a forgotten stage. Lucas had always found comfort in the woods. It was quiet there. No one expected him to talk. No one stared or waited. Just the rustling leaves, the rhythmic jingle of the silver bell on his wrist, and the soft padding of Max's footsteps behind him. That afternoon, like so many others, Lucas laced up his boots, grabbed his small backpack, and tapped gently on the floor. 2 soft knocks. Max, resting in his usual spot near the back door, lifted his head and stood. Though his limp remained, he never hesitated when Lucas called. They crossed into the woods with practiced ease. Lucas followed a narrow trail that wove through tall grass and old tree roots. Max followed close, nose to the air, occasionally nudging Lucas's hand with his snout, a quiet reassurance that he was still there. Half an hour into the walk, something caught Lucas's eye, a glint of light, reflecting off something near the edge of the trees. He paused, narrowing his eyes. A shallow dip in the ground led to what looked like a small, rocky alcove just beyond a muddy slope. Sunlight had bounced off the surface of water pooled inside. Curious, Lucas stepped off the trail and started toward it. Max whined softly behind him. Lucas turned and gave a reassuring wave, stepping carefully over a fallen branch. The earth beneath him was slick with wet pine needles and soft mud, but he moved slowly, trying to get a better look at the reflective surface. Then the ground gave way. In an instant, his right foot slid forward and his left lost traction. With a gasp, Lucas tumbled down the muddy incline, landing hard in a shallow depression filled with dark, cold water. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. For a moment, he just lay there, stunned. Then the pain hit, sharp and sudden in his ankle. He tried to move, but his foot wouldn't budge. Mud sucked at his boot like quicksand. The cold water was already soaking through his jeans, numbing his legs. Panic welled up in his chest. He opened his mouth. No sound came out. Up above, Max barked, loud and sharp, more sound than he'd made in weeks. He paced at the edge of the slope, whining, tail stiff, muscles tense. Lucas reached for his backpack, which had landed nearby, half submerged. His fingers brushed against the side pocket, where the emergency whistle James had given him was tucked away. But his hand trembled, and the whistle slipped beneath the surface, lost in the mud. Max barked again. Then something in him changed. The bark turned into a low growl, not of aggression, but determination. He glanced at the backpack, then lunged forward, teeth grabbing the top strap. He tugged hard, dragging it through the grass until it was back on stable ground. With one paw pinning it down, Max nosed through the outer pockets, snuffling with urgency. Then he found it. The whistle. It was attached to a small key ring, looped into one of the zippers. Max clenched it between his teeth and turned toward home. He ran. Every step was a struggle. His back leg trembled from the effort, and he stumbled more than once on the uneven terrain. But he didn't stop. The bell on his collar clinked wildly, bouncing against his chest, a frantic rhythm against the stillness of the woods. Back at the house, James was in the garage sorting through old tools when he heard it. The high-pitched shriek of the whistle, followed by a series of panicked barks. He dropped the wrench and ran outside. Max came charging around the side of the house, mud caked into his fur. The whistle still in his mouth, eyes wild with urgency. "Max!" James called out. Max dropped the whistle at James's feet, then turned and sprinted back the way he'd come, glancing over his shoulder every few steps. James didn't need more explanation. He grabbed a flashlight and followed. Max led him off the trail, into the trees, through muddy patches and under low branches, until they reached the slope. James saw it immediately, the torn earth, the backpack half submerged, and just beyond that, Lucas. The boy sat shivering in waist-deep water, one hand clutching a branch, his lips moving without sound. "Lucas!" James scrambled down, splashing into the water. He reached his son, pulling him close, cradling his wet face. "I've got you. It's okay. I've got you." Max stood at the edge of the slope, whimpering, pacing. Then, without hesitation, he began ringing the bell on his collar by shaking his head. The sound was urgent, rhythmic, his own signal for help. And he didn't stop until James turned and met his eyes. "Good boy," James whispered, voice cracking. "You found him. You saved him." Lucas, now wrapped in his father's arms, leaned into his chest. Max stepped to the edge and let out one final soft whine, his tail thumping weakly behind him, soaked and shaking. No one else saw it, but for a brief second, Lucas looked up, just long enough to lock eyes with Max. No words, no sounds, just the silent echo of a bond stronger than fear, and a dog who, even after all he'd been through, still knew how to save a life. James waded into the water without thinking. The moment he saw Lucas trapped in the muddy pit, his heart dropped into his stomach. His boots sank into the cold muck with every step, but he didn't care. All he could see was his son, shivering, soaked, cheeks pale beneath the fading light. One hand clutched a branch above him, the other held limply at his side. His face was streaked with mud, his eyes wide with fear. James reached him in 3 stumbling strides. "I've got you," he said over and over, voice shaking. "I've got you, son." Lucas didn't respond. Not with words, not even with a nod. He just leaned forward, collapsing into his father's chest. James gathered him up in both arms, staggering as he turned toward dry ground. Max, waiting anxiously at the top of the slope, took a step forward, then paused, tail still, ears trained on every sound. Step by step, James carried Lucas back to solid ground, every breath heavy, every heartbeat thudding in his ears. The boy weighed next to nothing. Too light, too quiet. James laid him down on a patch of dry leaves, pulling off his jacket and wrapping it tightly around Lucas's small frame. He ran a hand over his son's damp hair, brushing it away from his forehead, whispering things he didn't even know he was saying. Just words. Desperate ones. Then something happened. Lucas's lips parted. He took a shaky breath, his small chest rising and falling like a winded bird. His voice, unused for nearly a year, came out hoarse, barely louder than a whisper. "Max. Saved me." James froze. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He stared down at Lucas, unsure if he had imagined it. His pulse thundered in his ears. What did you say? Lucas blinked slowly, then louder this time, still broken but unmistakable. Max saved me. Tears welled in James's eyes before he could stop them. He reached for his son's hand, gripping it tightly as his throat closed up. You spoke, he whispered. Lucas, you spoke. Just then, Max padded forward slowly, as if sensing the shift in the air. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He approached Lucas with quiet, reverent steps and gently nudged his nose against the boy's open palm. Lucas's fingers curled instinctively into Max's fur. The moment stretched, beyond time, beyond words. The wind rustled through the trees, the sun slipped behind the clouds, and a hush fell over the woods like a blanket. In that sacred silence, something unspoken passed between the three of them. A recognition, a promise. Max had not just saved a boy from the cold and the mud. He had brought his voice back. He had reminded him that the world was still listening. James sat beside them, eyes full of tears, hand on his son's shoulder, watching as Max lowered his head and rested it on Lucas's chest, right over his heart. It wasn't a show of celebration. It wasn't the excitement of a hero returning home. It was something deeper. It was Max saying, I'm still here. And Lucas, still holding Max's fur, still trembling from the chill, closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath. A breath that, for the first time in nearly a year, wasn't weighed down by fear. Later, when James carried Lucas back through the woods, Max walked alongside them like a soldier guarding royalty. His limp was more pronounced, his body caked in mud, but he never left Lucas's side. The bell on Lucas's wrist jingled softly with each step, and Max's ears twitched at every chime, making sure the boy was still with him. James didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat still burned from the moment that had just passed. It wasn't until they reached the backyard and James set Lucas down on the porch that he found his voice again. You're safe now, he said gently. Lucas, half asleep in his arms, nodded once, then looked at Max. His lips parted again. He heard me, Lucas said, barely more than a breath. Even when I couldn't speak. James knelt beside him. He always did. They sat there for a long while, wrapped in blankets, Max curled at their feet, his breathing slow and steady. Neighbors began to appear after the commotion. Someone had heard the barking and called for help. Lights flickered on, voices filled the street, but none of it mattered. Not in that moment, because in that small backyard, under a graying sky, a boy had found his voice. A father had found his son again. And a dog, once discarded, once forgotten, had become something more than a hero. He had become the bridge between silence and sound, between despair and hope. They called it the voice of loyalty in the weeks that followed. The story spread through the neighborhood, then the town, then further, about the boy who hadn't spoken for nearly a year and the old Pitbull who brought his voice back without a single bark. But to James and Lucas, it wasn't just a story. It was the moment everything changed, the moment silence broke. And in that stillness that came after, the peace, the gratitude, the love, Max simply lay beside them, as if he'd known all along that this was what he was meant for. Not just to save a life, but to bring it fully back to the surface. Years passed gently, like pages turning in a well-loved book. Lucas grew taller, stronger. His voice, once hidden behind silence, grew steadier with time. He spoke with ease now, quietly, thoughtfully, but with confidence. His eyes, once downcast and uncertain, now held a quiet fire, a calm assurance that came not just from growing up, but from having been loved deeply, without condition. Through all those years, Max remained by his side. Though his body aged, his legs stiffer with each passing winter, his coat more silver than gray, his step slower and shorter. Max never wandered far from Lucas. They moved through life in quiet rhythm. Lucas went to school, made new friends, joined art clubs, read books out loud in the living room. Max would lie nearby, head resting on his paws, ears twitching at the sound of his boy's voice, the same voice he had once helped return. James, too, changed in his own way. The weight he'd carried after losing his wife softened over time. In the quiet moments, watching his son laugh or seeing Max's tail thump lazily against the floor, he would feel something like healing. The house that had once echoed with grief had become a sanctuary, a place stitched back together by the presence of an old dog and a quiet child who once couldn't speak. Then, one crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air feels cleaner and the sun shines with a softer golden hue, Lucas woke as usual and reached down to where Max always lay beside his bed. But Max didn't stir. His body was still warm, his fur soft under Lucas's palm. But there was no rise, no fall of breath, just a deep, perfect stillness. Lucas sat there for a long time. He didn't cry, not right away. He simply placed his hand gently over Max's chest, the place where he had once felt that steady heartbeat when he was scared, and listened to the silence that now lived there. It was not a silence of fear or emptiness. It was the quiet of peace, the kind Max had always given him. Later that day, Lucas and James wrapped Max's body in his favorite blanket. Together, father and son dug a small grave beneath the tall pine tree in the backyard, the one Max loved to nap beneath on warm afternoons. They placed beside him the few sacred items that told his story. The old K9 badge from his rescue days, the silver bell Lucas used to wear on his wrist, the worn photo of Max with the girl from long ago, and one of Lucas's sketches. Max, drawn with gentle pencil strokes, wearing a pair of angel wings. On the smooth stone that marked his resting place, Lucas carved the words, Max. He didn't bark much, but he saved us all. In the days that followed, the house felt different. Not empty, but quieter. Like something had shifted again. Lucas still walked the woods behind their home, still sat on the back steps with his notebook. But Max's absence lingered in the corners. In the soft thud that never came. In the missing weight at the foot of his bed. 1 week later, a letter arrived from the shelter where they had first found Max. A new pup had come in, a young Pitbull, rescued from a nearby construction site. Friendly, healthy, full of energy. They had remembered Lucas, remembered Max, and wondered if maybe the boy who once gave a forgotten dog a second chance might be willing to do it again. Lucas and James didn't speak much on the drive back to the shelter, but when they arrived, the staff led them to a small playpen where a clumsy, wide-eyed pup stood wagging his tail furiously, ears too big for his head. Lucas knelt down, and the puppy ran straight into his arms. They named him Echo. That night, Lucas had a dream. In it, Max was younger again, running beside him through fields of tall grass. The sky was endless, the wind soft. Max turned, gave a slow wag of his tail, and nudged Lucas forward, toward a bright, open path where Echo waited. Lucas awoke with tears on his cheeks and a strange calm in his chest. Sometime after midnight, as he tossed in bed from another half-dream, he felt something soft press against his chest. Not weighty, just a gentle touch. He opened his eyes. Echo was there, resting his muzzle over Lucas's heart, just like Max used to. Lucas reached up, placed a hand on the pup's head, and whispered into the dark. "You sent him, didn't you, Max?" From the nightstand, the little silver bell, now tied to the corner of a photo frame, jingled softly as the wind stirred through the open window. And in that moment, Lucas smiled. Because love, he knew, never really leaves. It just finds a new place to stay. And sometimes it comes back on 4 paws. Sometimes the most loyal hearts come in the quietest forms. If this story moved you, even just a little, we invite you to leave a comment, subscribe, and be part of the Veil Marks family. Every single subscription brings us closer to our dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers, a milestone that fuels our passion to keep creating meaningful, heartfelt content that honors stories like this one. As Maya Angelou once said, "People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." That's the essence of this story, and of every video we craft. This isn't just a video. It's a reminder that love never truly dies. It just finds new ways to return. Thank you for watching. Thank you for feeling. And thank you for believing in the power of stories that leave a mark on the world and on the heart.